All right. So the story is told of a fox. The fox was hungry. What does a fox do when it's hungry? It looks for something to eat. Going through the woods, looking around, nothing much today except a good-looking bird. The problem is the bird is a little too high up on the tree. So the fox gets into conversation with the bird, if that's at all possible, trying to convince the bird to come off the tree. And the bird is not too excited to join the fox in his show. The bird has been doing just fine on the tree and is not about to become prey for the fox. So they talk until the fox tells the bird, you know, you have nothing to fear from me. Moshiach has come. In the time of the Moshiach, we know the wolf will lie with the lamb, and nobody's going to hurt anybody else. I'm not going to touch you. Just come sit with me and let's celebrate. The Moshiach is here. For some reason, the bird wasn't too convinced, and she stayed on the tree. All of a sudden, they hear noise. Hunters coming with their dogs. So the fox says, what do you see? What do I see? I see nothing much, just a couple guys, hunters with all their equipment, the weapons, and their hunting dogs. So the fox starts to run away. The bird says, where are you running? I thought the Moshiach came. Nobody's going to hurt you. See, the fox turns around and shouts as best as he possibly could, those dogs, they don't believe in the Moshiach. So all jokes aside, it references, in a way, the mystery of the coming of the Moshiach and the mystery of what does it mean, what is really going to happen, what are the dogs not believe, what do we really believe, what's really the story of the coming of Moshiach. But actually, it'll be a little easier if we define some terms a little bit, and we'll do that right here. What you see here are just some basic definitions of the terms we use. We throw around kind of the galut and the redemption. What do these things mean? Well, the galut is the period since the destruction of the temple. The exile, you see it translated up there? The exile from the land of Israel, the period that we live in today, ever since the temple has been destroyed, but we have no temple with which to experience the presence of God in the way we were able to back then. It also means, as in the original Hebrew term, golah. Golah is the biblical term for galut that means literally diaspora. The Jewish people have been scattered from their homeland in Jerusalem and the land of Israel throughout the world. Redemption is a word you might hear a lot, or geula in Hebrew. And that is when we're restored to Israel, not just that we actually enter the land of Israel, which thank God is possible today, but its complete sense with the coming of Moshiach and the temple. And as we go through these classes and more like them, the picture of what does it mean being in Israel with Moshiach versus just going to Israel on a tourist flight, that picture will become more clear to us as we continue to study these ideas. And finally, Messiah, Moshiach, is the leader, the one who's going to make this all happen. And I see I'm blocking it. The leader who will bring about Geula, the one who will bring the redemption, is the one we call the Moshiach. So when you hear these terms, try not to get confused. Redemption from what? Exile from what? This is the idea. This is what these things mean. The Galut, the Geula, the exile, the redemption, and the coming of Moshiach. The question, though, is, how did that come to be? How will it come to be? What is going to happen? The coming of Moshiach that will change all of this? How is that going to happen? Particularly, our question for today is it going to be an explosion, something grand happening all at once? Boom, the Moshiach has arrived, the world has changed in some way that we can't fathom, some miracle? Or is this a normal, natural process that we could appreciate, that we could perhaps understand and make sense of in some form or another? So this is actually a tricky question. When I say a tricky question, that's because usually People ask me questions about all kinds of important Jewish topics. Is there free choice in Judaism? The answer is yes. Is there an afterlife? All kinds of topics people ask, and usually the answer is very straightforward. This time, that doesn't work so well. What's the problem? What's wrong this time? Well, the way I answer those other questions, straightforward as they come to the best of my ability, is from decades of studying Torah. But if we open the Torah to try to answer this question and understand, is Moshiach coming as one big boom? Or is it something which is a gradual process happening over time? To answer this question, we get lost in a maze of sources. We get lost in a whole conversation that we don't know where it begins, where it ends, what is actually going to be the story. Will it be the coming of Moshiach all at once, or will we have some kind of process ongoing? In other words, the sources seem to be conflicting on this matter. And I'm going to bring it back up on the screen. That's going to be text 1 that you have on page 2. You'll also have it here. And that's what tells us the first side of the coin. And as you will see, this is going to get complicated. So this is a prophecy of Malachi, as you see in the bottom. Malachi writes, translated, "Behold, I send my angel, and he will clear a way before me. And suddenly, God whom you seek will come to his temple. And behold, the angel of the covenant whom you desire is coming, says God of hosts." So suddenly, as a very sudden explosion, if you will, the Moshiach suddenly appears. The God who you seek returns to the temple. Everything changes all at once, all of the sudden. This seems to make a very clear case that, boom, we wake up one morning or we go to sleep one night or sometime in between. The Moshiach is here and it all happens. What that all is, we have weeks to talk about. But that all happens in one big poof. As you see at the top, poof or process, this would say poof, not process. Well, let's try another text, which will support the same thing. This is a letter of the Rambam, Maimonides, where he says the Messiah will be unknown before his coming, but he will prove by means of miracles and wonders that he is the true Messiah. The mere report of his advent will strike terror into the hearts of all the kings of the earth, and their kingdoms will fall as they'll be unable to make war or revolt against him. They will neither defame, deny, nor question him. For the miracles that he will perform will frighten them into complete silence. Isaiah refers to the submission of the kings to the Messiah. In the verse, kings shall shut their mouths, for he will be unlike anything they ever saw or heard. He will slay whom he will. None will escape or be saved. It is written, he shall smite the land with the rod of his mouth. So, in case it wasn't clear enough, here we have a longer reading of Maimonides, where Maimonides makes a very clear case that some unbelievable king is going to show up, and everyone is just going to have to toe the line, and it's all going to work out the way he wills, so he will get rid of the evil, and etc., etc. Sounds great. Now the challenge is what's going to come in the next text. So far, we've been saying quite clearly that the coming of Moshiach will be sudden. But here, we see another story. This is the Jerusalem Talmud. So usually when we say the Talmud, we're referring to the Babylonian Talmud. But here we're actually going to have a reading from the Jerusalem Talmud, which was composed earlier in the land of Israel and is basically a similar type of work. You have this on page 4, or again up here on the screen. Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta were walking in the valley of Arba, and they witnessed the advent of dawn. Rabbi Chia told Rabbi Shimon, "So will be the redemption of the Jewish people. At first, it will be a trickle. As it continues, it will gain steam and expand. As is stated, though I sit in darkness, God is a light to me." What does this suggest? Does anybody want to tell me how they understand it. This seems to say that like the dawn, it's going to slowly develop the light. The trickle, as it continues, it will gain steam. The Moshiach won't necessarily come all at once in a big explosion. Little things will happen. The world would gradually, maybe naturally, change and become a better place. Much different. Well, a better place ultimately means that yes, the presence of God is felt, and therefore all the goodness we talk about in the time of Mashiach will become a reality. But the truth of the matter is, as we continue to learn about the Mashiach, we'll get a better understanding what exactly the better place is, how that better place will be, and what it actually means. For the meanwhile, we see that it's somehow a step-by-step process. That is reinforced by the next text. This is Maimonides again, making it all the more strange. Text 4, you have on page 5. One should not presume that the Messianic king must work miracles and wonders, bring about new phenomena in the world, resurrect the dead, or perform other similar deeds. This is not the case. What is the case then? Let's see. Do not presume that in the Messianic age, any facet of the world's nature will change or there'll be innovations in the work of creation. Nothing dramatic, nothing miraculous, nothing unnatural. Rather, the world will continue according to its pattern. Our sages taught there'll be no difference between the current age and the Messianic age, except our emancipation from the subjugation to the Gentile kingdoms. In other words, now we don't have our true independence, and that doesn't mean only in the sense of independence in the land of Israel, but the true freedom to live as a Jew in its complete way without outside pressure. And when the Moshiach comes, we will have that. In other words, Rambam Maimonides says, this is not something out of this world. This is not something crazy or unnatural. This is something which is a developing process in our world. We will be freed from the challenges of life the way we have it today and free to serve God in its complete and truest form. But that doesn't mean that miracles have to happen. That doesn't mean that some of these crazy things you may have heard about the coming of Moshiach have to happen. And what that leaves us is with a contradiction. We had two texts, and there are many more, that suggest that it's going to be a sudden arrival of the Moshiach, boom, and the world will change. And two texts, and there are many more that say the same idea, that it's going to be a gradual process. What do we make of this? So in other words, if you came to join us because you wanted to know which way is it going to be, is it really going to be so fun and exciting like people say, or is it a little more sane? Well, instead of giving the answer, I'm here to make the question more pronounced and to say that it doesn't seem clear within the Torah itself. How will we break free from this issue? Well, the interesting thing is that the Talmud addresses this question. Yes, Doctor.
Do you believe that two different views contradict each other?
So far, they seem to contradict each other, but if you want to suggest a way... Sorry?
Your opinion.
My opinion as I study Torah always is that there's some way to reconcile it. And what we do is we look to find reconciliation, especially in this scenario. You notice one of the first two was Maimonides, Rambam, and then he came again saying the opposite. So one guy has got to make up his mind. Rambam was a pretty smart individual. He wasn't drinking too much. So which way? So thank God the Talmud addresses this question, not so directly, but in the context of other contradictions and different issues we have to clarify about the coming of Moshiach. The Talmud gives us a key which resolves this question and many more like it. So again, we're trying to understand how can it be that there is a conflict or two different texts that suggest on one hand that the Moshiach is a gradual process. On the other hand, it's this one big explosion that happens all at once. In other words, a more natural, stable, human, normal kind of thing, just a better life in this world, or something totally out of this world, something totally miraculous. Well, let's read this reading from the Talmud. This is in the Tractate Sanhedrin, in the chapter that addresses the coming of Moshiach. Sure.
Moshiach is presumed to be a person, right?
Yes.
So that person is going to be born. So it's going to be a child. So it's going to be a process for that person to become a certain age. Do we know what age that person will be when we're going to know that this is a Moshiach, or how's that going to happen?
We don't know, and that's a good question. And essentially, in that last reading from the Rambam, the one where he described it as miraculous, he says that this guy appears. In other words, as suggested in many places, that individual might not even know himself that he is supposed to do this job until a certain point. So he's obviously a great person and a good person and someone invested in all kinds of righteous things, but at a certain point is when he begins this role.
So the time when we say the coming of Mashiach will start counting that this is the time, what this is the day. It's going to be when it's going to become obvious and widely accepted that this is the day when he appeared to us as a Mashiach, right?
So in other words, how do we define the point? What does it start? What does it mean Moshiach came if he's been here before? Well, this is something we're going to get to over time, but essentially the moment that Moshiach builds the temple, that is the starting point of the actual times of Moshiach. Everything before that is great, but it's preparation.
Okay, so that's when people will stop dying, right?
We're going to talk about that because other things can happen at different times. All right, so Amar Rabbi Alexandria says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi raises a contradiction. This is, again, in your book on page 6. The verse, I, God, in its time, I will hasten it, reads, in its time, indicating there's a designated time for the redemption. And it reads, I will hasten it, indicating there's no set time for the redemption. On the one hand, saying the redemption, the coming of Moshiach will be in its time, at a certain predetermined time. On the other hand, we're saying it's going to be hastened. In other words, it can happen anytime. It can happen faster. Which way? Says the Talmud of Alexandria explains, if they merit, I will hasten the coming of Mashiach. If they do not merit, Messiah will come in his designated time. In other words, if the Jewish people merit, if we do something great and special, that will cause the coming of Mashiach sooner, faster, before the predetermined time. Otherwise, it's going to happen at the deadline, when it's meant to happen. In other words, there's two possibilities, two general ways of this all happening. If you've been around in our classes, and I think all of you have, you certainly heard many times before that you do another mitzvah, you bring the coming of Mashiach closer. We bring more good into this world, the Mashiach might come today. In fact, it's a process going on since the creation of the world. God created the world with negativity and darkness that we all see and experience, unfortunately. And we're here to change it. We're here to do mitzvahs, to bring good, to make the world a better place until it reaches the time of the Mashiach. That's wonderful. But what if it doesn't happen? What if we don't do enough good? Not that I'm afraid that will happen. We believe that Jewish people are trying their best. We're not perfect, but we're doing more and more mitzvahs and we're getting there. But theoretically speaking, God created the world with a plan, but he gave us free choice. So now what if we don't live up to the plan? Sorry? So then the Mashiach would never come. That may have seemed to be the case, but what we saw in that text is that there is a designated time of the coming of Mashiach, even if we will not merit. In other words, Our job is to do good, make the Moshiach come. If we don't, God will bring the Moshiach anyway, at a predetermined deadline. God never intended to create a world that's going to be always dark and always have the negativity that we all unfortunately see too much of. God created a world to be perfect. He challenged us with a world where it's not easy to be a good person and it's not easy to do the mitzvahs, and we have to work our way through it. But ultimately, we get to that perfect point. Ultimately, we get to where we're supposed to be. And therefore, even if we don't do the mitzvahs, God forbid, we don't achieve enough, ultimately at some point is going to happen. This is what the Talmud says. There are two ways this could happen. It could happen at a designated time when the deadline is reached and God kind of says, you guys are good for nothing. You leave all the work for me and I'll fix up this place. Or the good way is Zachu, we were merited, as we read. And when we merit, we did so much good, we made the world good. And whenever we do enough of that, the Mashiach can come right now. This turns out to be the defining factor and the answer also to our original questions. As we'll see that in yet another reading. Any questions online? Alex or Alan? Okay, we got your agreement. So the Or HaChaim, Rabbi Chaim ben Attar, lived, I'd say, 17th century, 18th century in Morocco. If the redemption will arrive through the merits of the Jewish people, it will be wondrous. The Redeemer will appear miraculously from the heavens. By contrast, the Jews are unworthy, and the redemption comes only because the clock ran out. It will be different. Regarding which the Talmud says, the Redeemer will arrive as a pauper riding on a donkey. The prophecy that the redemption will be hastened will occur if the Jewish people will be worthy. Regarding a redemption in the set time, the verse states that a ruler will rise in Israel naturally, as do all the rulers in this world. In other words, he's explaining to us here, it's not only about the time, that if we do the right thing, it comes sooner, and if not, it comes later, but also the way it happens. We're trying to figure out if it's going to be miraculous or natural, if it will just happen all at once in a miracle and things will go flying, or it will just be a change of circumstance within the natural world. Well, that depends on us. That depends if we merit or not, depends on which way the Moshiach ends up coming. So both of those options are true. Depends on how it plays out. Yes?
So when you're saying if Jewish people do this, then Mashiach will come sooner. If they don't do it, it will happen at the latest time. Is there a percentage of Jewish people, or it has to be every single one?
One moment. This is funny.
There are Jews
I
that
can't see if I'm muted or not. This freaking black thing.
that are worthy today, maybe. But I mean, how many of them has to happen?
Okay, there it goes.
Jews that we all know,
I think I'm muted.
they will never change. You know.
So in other words, what does it take? How much do we need to invest to make this happen? So it's a very important topic, and I'll just touch upon this very briefly for right now. The Rebbe actually said, and we're going to get back around to this, that we have already achieved enough. And he said this doesn't mean that we're all perfect, but it means we've hit the benchmark. And actually, the fact that we hit that benchmark means that it's easier to keep doing even more good and add to that, etc., etc. So yes, there is a kind of minimum. It's not everybody being perfect all the time. This is, as the Talmud would often say, the Torah wasn't given for angels. Torah is given for us. We live as humans in this world. We're not perfect. We're not expected to be perfect, but we're expected to do a good job. When we do that good job, we're worthy, and like I said, we're going to come back around to it. So, bottom line, we've addressed the core question here, that will it be miraculous or natural? Depends on which option of his coming. Now, I need to clarify something here. And this is something that Maimonides, Rambam, about the text he said before, that it's all going to be natural, it's just a change and a regime change. if the Jewish people will be free and independent to serve God, well, the Rambam gets a lot of slack for that. A lot of other writings that complain, what do you mean? What about the resurrection of the dead? What about all these other miraculous things that will happen when Moshiach comes? Those things will happen. Those things will happen regardless of which way the Moshiach comes. The question is only when. So if Moshiach comes in the natural form, in the slow way because we didn't do such a good job, then he comes naturally. He comes when there was no choice but for God to step in and bring him. And then from that point on, we start to shape up. Now that the Mashiach is here, the temple has been built, we see the truth, we see God's presence. Now we start to do the right thing. And as we grow and improve, we reach that point where those miracles will happen. So the question is not if the miracles will happen, the question is when. Do we say the coming of Mashiach right now, an explosion of miracles? Or do we say he's going to come and make these natural changes, which will make us in that better world able to grow and improve, and then we'll be worthy of the miraculous time, which will come later. So let's not get confused. Let's not assume that it might just be an all natural way and the miracles will be missed out on. Let's actually understand that it's only a question of when they will come into play. All right, now there's another couple things we should understand about this good option. The option of us doing enough mitzvahs and investing enough good to make Moshiach come is not only about the timing, not only about the miracles, but it impacts everything. And one of those things is something that some of us might be concerned about, if you've heard of it. There are a lot of writings in the Talmud and elsewhere that describe the process of coming of Mashiach. Frightening things. Before the coming of Mashiach, this will happen, that will happen, a lot of suffering and difficulty, some of which we've already seen. But overall, it's not something anybody wants to experience. In fact, the coming of Mashiach is compared to the birth of a child. That before the Mashiach comes, we are here, just like the fetus is there, it's in the womb, but it's all closed up. The coming of Mashiach is the opening, the revelation when we come out. Well, to get from in the womb to being born as a live child, there's labor. It's not fun and not easy. It's painful and difficult. The coming of Mashiach is sometimes compared to those pangs of labor. Till it happens, till that comes about, till we're able to actually get to that point, there's a lot of suffering and challenge along the way. Well, guess what? If it happens in the good way, if it happens in the zachu, the meritorious way that we've done enough mitzvahs, those rules don't necessarily apply. We can skip some of that road. We can have a quick and easy birth and not suffer so much on the way. Let's see that right here. And this is, boom. This is text 7, page 10. When the Talmud and Medrash speak of the many changes that will occur prior to Mashiach's arrival, the context is such that events must occur only prior to redemption that comes in the designated time. Thus, Moshe and all subsequent sages anticipated redemption of Achishena, so that everything can be in the best possible manner. In other words, along with it happening Achishena sooner in the meritorious way, it also happens in a better way, a less painful way overall. Another benefit of this better option is what that means spiritually. And for that, we need a little bit of an introduction. We have to remember things that we talked about at other times, but that our world was created by God, but God's presence is hidden within it. We don't always get to see it or experience it or know about it. Although God created, God is behind it all. Why is that? God hid his presence and made it up to us to find him in this world. Every time we do something right, Every time we do a mitzvah, every time we do something good, we're expressing God in the world we live in. We've taken this whole space, turned it into a sukkah, turned it into a place of a mitzvah, turned it into a place now of Torah learning. All of the equipment and wires in all direction, they've also become part of serving God. They've become tools for expressing God in this world. The more good we do, the more mitzvahs we do, the more we take the simple, physical, even dark, challenging world around us and make it godly, make it good, make it right. When we reach the peak of that, that's the coming of Moshiach. However, if it comes the slow way, that means that we didn't do our job in changing the darkness into light. It means the darkness just expired. God only allowed for the negative and the darkness to be here for a certain amount of time. It ran out of time, so it's gone. But we never cashed in on it. In other words, the negativity of this world is not created to make us suffer. It's not created to give us a hard time. It's not created to make us sad. It is created for us to change it, to transform it. It's raw material that we can turn into something good. We can add it to our account. We can make that be part of the story of the coming of Moshiach. That's up to us. If we do it the good way, if we invest, if we do those mitzvahs and change the world to have Moshiach come, we add that darkness into light. If not, the darkness just disappears and we don't get all of the achievements we could have achieved in this world. Let's read about that right here. There is indeed a paradigm by which the verse states God set a date for evil. Creation itself dictates that evil only has a certain time span, after which it will expire and disappear without a trace. As the verse states, and I will remove the spirit of veil from this world. This should be evil. However, this paradigm is only reserved for a situation in which the Jewish people haven't managed to make such a reality happen with their own transformative work. Then indeed the end of days happens on its own. However, if the Jews are so worthy and transform the world, the redemption will arrive prior to its allotted time. For though the clock will not yet have run out on evil, the Jews will have managed to banish it with their transformative work. This then is the true quality of Achishana over Be'ita. It transforms even the darkest of evils. So, bottom line, it's up to us. We do more good. We make the coming of Mashiach sooner, more miraculous, less painful along the way, and we carry with us the negative of this world that we transformed into good. Everyone is then going to want to know, so what's the bottom line? Which road are we on? Are we getting it the good way? Is it happening? Or are we not making enough progress and we're going to have it the cop-out way, the slow way? So I know how it feels when we look around. I know how it feels when we look around the world we live in. It doesn't look like we're anywhere near having changed the world and ready for the good coming of Moshiach. Therefore, it might come as a surprise that in the writings of the Rebbe, it is sharp and clear, absolute truth that we're going to have it soon and we're going to have it the good way. Moshiach will be coming imminently and coming because we've achieved the goodness that we're supposed to achieve. Now, when you say this, everybody says, come on. That's not the reality we live in. Before, they want to know, what am I smoking when we talk like this? It's just not the way the world seems to be. Doesn't seem to have gotten to become such a good place. So what does this really mean? Well, the first thing is that slide that came up a little early, and that is a treasure chest. Why do we have a slide of a treasure chest? Well, the treasure chest is not a treasure chest in this world, it's a treasure chest in the godly world. In other words, Chassidus teaches us that ever since the Torah was given at Mount Sinai 3,332 years ago, Jews have been doing mitzvahs. Other people have been doing good things. The world has been making progress in all this time. But all that good achievement, in a sense, it's piling up in the box. All of that treasure is being collected. No mitzvah ever disappears. Nothing that was done good in this world goes without credit, without going on the record. It goes into the box. Obviously, it's a spiritual, it's an analogy, but it is counted for. And it builds up and builds up and builds up to a point where God says, we made it, and he unleashes it. He unleashes that goodness into our world. That is the miraculous coming of Moshiach. In other words, the fact that the world doesn't necessarily seem any better is not the way we're supposed to measure. The world goes through its dark reality. We have to struggle to do the right thing within the dark reality. But every time we win the struggle, God collects that goodness until he's ready to unleash it all, open the chest with the coming of Moshiach. So that's the first thing we need to know. When the Rebbe tells us from a spiritual view, from a spiritual perspective, that we've done it, the coming of Moshiach is imminent, that means the chest is full. That doesn't necessarily mean something that we can already see. However, together with that, we need to broaden our perspective, I would say. And that is to understand that the coming of Moshiach is actually taking place in our world. We have been making that progress. It doesn't always seem that way because we don't always look at the big picture. But what we've filled into the box is not only in the box, but the goodness that we have done has begun to change the world that we live in. And if we look at the course of history as the full picture, we look back to where it started and continue on to where we are today, we see actually tremendous progress has been made. Let's take some examples. We know that at the coming of Moshiach, Maimonides writes, there will be no hunger. There'll be prosperity, there'll be abundance for everyone. Compare the reality of no hunger today to even a century ago. We've obviously made tremendous progress in that direction. Sure, there's more progress that needs to be made, but there's undeniably more food available for more people, even the poorest of people, than there has been throughout history. That is a world changing towards the time of Moshiach when nobody will have to worry about it. Maimonides also describes the time coming of Moshiach as a time with no disease. We can all wish for that right now.
Yes. Especially on
We all know that there's still disease and it's changing our world as we know it. But nevertheless, the reality we live in compared to the reality of just a few centuries ago is almost one of no disease. Pretty much almost all of the serious diseases of previous time have a cure. The life expectancy is tremendously greater. Why and how does this happen? Of course, this is the advance of science and of knowledge and helping people, but that also means that we're getting closer to that better time, and that's why the world is actually becoming that better place.
So if today's arrangement between United Arab Emirates and Israel could be also a sign of big improvement. It's like a historic event.
I'm not going to comment on it too much because it's politically intertwined, but I will say that the Rebbe didn't like these agreements.
Didn't like it. Huh?
No, they don't usually work out very well. The other examples, we really can go on and on, but there's a couple examples the Rebbe highlighted, and which again, although they're not perfect yet, they're tremendous progress. One is the very idea of democracy and rights for all people. Not everyone lives in our world yet it got to experience democracy and human rights, but more and more of civilization is getting there. In fact, the Rebbe spoke about this when the Soviet Union fell, when China started to change, India, and other civilizations which changed actually without even battle, but came at least closer to more freedom for more people. That would also be a sign of Moshiach. But perhaps one of the most dramatic signs, and one of the most explicit things, the Rebbe spoke about this in 1992, very shortly before the Rebbe's stroke, is the pursuit of peace. Now, again, this is where people complain, what kind of pursuit of peace? There's so much war. There's so much war, but you still cannot compare war to what there used to be. In fact, there exists an organization, a terrible organization, called the United Nations, which makes so much trouble for Israel and the Jewish people. But nevertheless, the very idea that there exists a forum whose stated goal is the prophecy of Isaiah, of Yeshaya, to beat their swords into plowshares, that is tremendous progress towards the coming of Moshiach. That is a world that is beginning to realize that peace should be the ultimate goal and not war. Up until, I would say, World War I, there was no such attitude. The attitude was be more powerful, win the wars, right, might is right. The attitude changed. Sure, everybody's cheating on it, especially in the United Nations, but at least they've begun to pay lip service, and at least they've begun to move in the direction that there should be less war. And in fact, as a result of that, there is much less war and much less actual killing of people in battle. In fact, the Rebbe spoke about this when the first George Bush, and Yeltsin met to discuss reducing arms. We talked about this before, some time ago, but this is always worth getting into again. In these times, heads of state the world over have decided to reduce their weapons capacity and invest in economic, peaceful measures. This is, after all, what the prophet promises, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, dismantling weapons and fashioning them into tools to work the ground to produce bread. So the prophet says something that sounds crazy 2,500 years ago when he says it, that there'll be no more war. People will take their swords, and instead of swords, they'll change them to plowshares. Sounds nice, but when is it ever going to happen? Well, in 91, 92, with the START Treaty and other treaties, the United States and the Soviet Union at that time reached an agreement where they're going to reduce nuclear warheads and reduce military spending in order to increase in agricultural development and other positive civilized development. If that's not a taste of the coming of Moshiach, then what is? So, yes, we live in a challenging world, especially last few months, we can say, but we definitely are making progress towards that better world. We're definitely making progress towards that time when we will see the world that we have transformed. And we're definitely about to have the time of the miraculous coming of the Moshiach. Before we conclude with a final interesting point, any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I'm just curious, is there any significance that the new year is going to be 3,333 in relation to?
Well, it's an interesting number, and the Rebbe spoke about them. So, and mentioned that it's 3,332 years since the Torah was given, which means the next year is 4-3, is 3,333. So she's asking, is that significant in any way? Well, the interesting thing is, I didn't think about this, but there is a talk of the Rebbe in 1991 where he talks about the power of the number 3. He talks about that in connection to the giving of the Torah, and the whole idea of the Torah is what we talked about earlier, to take a physical world and combine it with the spiritual energy, to take that dark and bring it together with the goodness, which means take two sides and bring them together, which is what the number 3 represents according to the Kabbalah, that it's merging one and one by the power of the third. That's what 3 is. So 3 in the coming year may have a relevance to that. That would be interesting. But that's off the top of my head. I can't sign off on it. Anyhow, there is a fascinating point the Rebbe makes, which has to do in some degree, and this is for fun, so you'll forgive me, with this slide. Of course, this has been going around everywhere since Putin said that the Russians have a vaccine for coronavirus, that this is the vaccine, just a good injection of vodka and you're ready to go. But I'm using this slide not to comment on vaccines, I'm not a doctor, but to comment on the drinking. And what that means is, there is a law in the halacha that a Kohen, I don't think anybody that's here right now is a Kohen, but a Kohen who is the one who would serve in the temple and gets the first aliyah in the synagogue, etc., a Kohen cannot drink. So if anybody wants to be a Kohen, there's a drawback. You cannot drink. Too much l'chaim for a Kohen is a problem. Why? Because Moshiach might come any moment. Now, practically speaking, since all of our Kohanim are not ready because they need to be organized into the units and all the different things, so this law doesn't actually apply. But the core law is that a Kohen could never drink alcohol because it's forbidden for a Kohen to serve in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple, to bring the sacrifices or do this, whatever it is, while being intoxicated. It's against the rules. Actually, there were two Kohanim who died for it. The Torah tells us a story. They drank and then they served in the temple. God took their lives. It's against the rule. So a Kohen cannot drink even today when there's no temple. The question, of course, is why? Why can't he drink if when the temple will be built? He'll be sober by then. Well, the answer is that we expect the temple to be rebuilt any moment. We expect the coming of Moshiach, poof, as they termed it for this lesson, all of the sudden, and so quickly and so miraculously, there'll immediately be a temple. In fact, in halacha, everything goes in a measurement. The measurement for drinking to intoxication is about 3.5 ounces. The measurement for getting rid of that is only 24 minutes. 24 minutes later, it's possible, depending on the person, that should have worn off. So you're telling a Kohen, don't dare drink three plus ounces, because within the next 24 minutes, before you can recover, Moshiach might already be here, the temple might already be built, and boom, you got to be ready. That's how immediate this idea is in the Jewish faith. So we should never look at this as something which is removed, which is distant, or not about to happen right now before us in a practical sense, because our belief, to the point that that's the law, is that it could happen and will happen with God's help at any given moment.
So how come Kohanim are having more time to us?
So the answer to that in brief is that there are 24 familial groups of Kohanim, and within each one there are sections. In order to serve in the temple, you need to know which line you're in, and none of today's Kohanim do. So they'll need a lot more than 24 minutes to get their information set up and get ready. So anyway, they're not ready the first moment. But essentially, it means in the first period after the destruction, the Kohanim knew which family they're from, and they knew their requirements. They were ready. As soon as there'll be a temple, they're going to run. That was forgotten over time, so it needs to be reorganized. So that gives them kind of off the hook. They're able to drink now, in case they're desperate to, and they'll still be able to be ready when they would, through the delay that they need to have otherwise. Next week, the same time in the same place, we have a rather dramatic class, and that's Gog and Magog. I don't know if you've ever heard these names. Gog and Magog are two names of great nations that are described in the prophecy as having a tremendous war before the coming of Moshiach, which basically brings all the nations of the world into Israel and creates a boom disaster, as you see in the bottom, apocalypse. So what is really going to happen? Because this sounds turbulent and terrible. We want to find out that it's terrific. What is the apocalypse in Jewish thought? What is this tremendous explosion of the end of days? What's the myth and what's the fact? And what does it mean? We're going to talk about that next week. But 2 points. Firstly, we tried to have it sprayed this week. I see it didn't work very well, but I hope it's been okay. Next week, with God's help, a little bit better. So don't give up hope. And secondly, in order to encourage our friends to join, we need a picture of how beautiful it looks. We can take it from the back in case anybody doesn't want to feature themselves in the picture. We just need a volunteer who wants to stand from the back and shoot a picture of us. Anyone? You got it? We have too many.
Take a picture of this and then take another picture.
Thank you.
Has to come to Israel, or all works has to come to Israel.
You mean in this battle we talk about? We'll have to
Yeah.
discuss it next week because it's a big mystery. All right. Thanks for joining. I'm going to release
Thank you, Rabbi.
joining out online. And have a great week. We'll see you next week, either online or in person, whatever you prefer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.